This is where seawater enters the plant, 40 million gallons a day at full capacity, screened here for debris before it ever reaches the high-pressure side. You'll spend most of your first month out here, honestly, because intake fouling is the least glamorous problem in this whole facility, and somebody new always gets it. 14 years ago, when I started exactly where you're standing, this plant ran at a flat, constant pressure around the clock, inefficient by modern standards, expensive, but mechanically simple in a way I didn't fully appreciate until we lost that simplicity. My twin sister, Mira, was 3 buildings over at the parent utility's headquarters by then, already deep into the energy optimization work that would eventually become FlowOptim, the system that runs most of what you'll see today. People ask us constantly what it's like working across the same industry as your own twin, and I've never found a satisfying short answer. The honest one is that we've spent our whole lives finishing each other's technical sentences and occasionally, catastrophically, assuming that meant we always agreed about what those sentences implied. Growing up, teachers used to separate us into different classrooms specifically to stop us finishing each other's answers before the other kids had a chance to think, and I sometimes wonder whether that habit, more than anything either of us studied later, is the real reason it took 2 years for either of us to say the disagreement out loud plainly enough for it to actually register. I want you to understand something before we go any further in. Mira didn't build FlowOptim to cut corners. She built it because this plant, running flat pressure around the clock, was burning through electricity at peak rate pricing for no reason except that nobody had ever bothered to ask whether it needed to. FlowOptim shifted our heaviest production into off-peak hours, cut our energy costs by nearly a third within its first year, and made this plant considerably more financially viable than it had ever been under the old flat-pressure model. That's real. I'd never tell you otherwise, whatever else I'm about to walk you through. This is where the actual work happens, 42 pressure vessels running reverse osmosis membranes, each one pushing seawater through at close to 900 pounds per square inch to strip the salt out on the other side. FlowOptim's cost model tracks exactly 2 things closely, output volume and electricity price, and it optimizes beautifully against both. What it was never built to track was what happens to a membrane housing mechanically when you stop running it at a flat, constant pressure and start cycling it up and down every few hours to chase off-peak electricity rates. I raised this with Mira almost 2 years before anything actually went wrong, not because I'd found a problem yet, just because I'd read enough fatigue engineering to have a bad feeling about it. I remember the exact conversation, both of us on a video call late on a Tuesday, her in her office with the city skyline behind her and me still in my work clothes at the kitchen table, the particular kind of call 2 sisters who'd grown up sharing everything could have without either of us needing to soften how directly we said things to each other. Every pressure cycle is a small mechanical stress event on the housing seals and the membrane matrix itself, Mira. Flat pressure 24 hours a day barely stresses them at all. Cycling twice a day, every day, for years, that's a fatigue loading pattern. Nobody designed these components to survive indefinitely. She wasn't dismissive, for the record. She never has been, not with me, not about this plant. What she said was, FlowOptim's cost model doesn't have fatigue data to work from, because nobody's ever built that dataset for membrane housings under cyclic loading. I can't optimize against a cost I don't have a number for. Then maybe the number needs building before we let the model keep running the plant this way for another 5 years. Or maybe you're describing a theoretical pattern that hasn't actually shown up anywhere in 2 years of cycling, and I can't justify slowing this plant's efficiency gains down over a hypothesis. Neither of us was fully wrong. That's the part that took me longest to make peace with. Come around here. See this housing, the one with the replacement tag still on it? This is where it actually happened, 18 months after that conversation with Mira, on a Thursday morning during the ramp-up to full daytime capacity. Housing 11 on rack 6 had been cycling twice daily for a little over 2 years by then, same as every other rack in this hall, when a microtear developed in the membrane matrix itself, not from any single dramatic event, just the accumulated fatigue of thousands of pressure cycles finally finding the weakest point in the material. It didn't show up as a pressure alarm. It didn't show up as a flow discrepancy large enough to trip any threshold FlowOptim was watching. What it did was let a small but genuinely alarming amount of brine bypass the membrane entirely, contaminating product water right as the ramp to full capacity was pushing that exact rack's output toward the distribution system. I was standing about where you're standing now when the water quality alarm finally tripped, salinity reading climbing on the downstream sensor in a pattern I recognized immediately, because I'd spent 2 years half expecting to see it. I remember the specific, sinking clarity of that recognition, the way your body knows before your brain fully catches up that the thing you argued about theoretically 2 years ago just stopped being theoretical, and everything after that moment moves at a speed that doesn't feel like it belongs to you anymore, hands reaching for the shutdown sequence almost before you've consciously decided to. We shut Rack 6 down within 4 minutes of the alarm, while inside our contamination response window, no product water left this facility outside spec that morning. I want you to understand that clearly, because the version of this story that gets exaggerated in the break room makes it sound worse than it actually was. Nobody downstream drank bad water. The system worked, at the layer it was built to work at. What didn't work was catching the actual cause before it got that far. I spent the rest of that morning here, at this exact console, running the shutdown checklist alongside a technician named Osei who'd worked this hall almost as long as I had, both of us moving through the procedure with the particular calm that comes less from actually feeling calm and more from having drilled the steps so many times that your hands know them independently of whatever your chest is doing. I pulled the maintenance history on Housing 11 myself that same afternoon, once the immediate response was fully closed, and the fatigue pattern was right there once I knew to look for it, a slow, steady increase in microvibration readings across 2 years of cycling that nobody had ever flagged as meaningful. Because FlowOptim's dashboard had never been built to track vibration trend data against a fatigue model that didn't formally exist yet. I called Mira before I called anyone else. Housing 11, Rack 6. Membrane tear, cyclic fatigue, exactly the pattern I described 2 years ago. She was quiet long enough that I could hear her pulling up the maintenance records herself on the other end of the line. The vibration data was there the whole time. It was there the whole time, Mira. Nobody built it into the model because the model was never asked to care about it. Come through here a second before the engineering office, because this is exactly where the exaggerated version of the story usually gets told, and I want you to hear why it drifts the way it does. By the time word of the shutdown made it around the plant that week, most people 2 shifts removed from the actual event had heard some version involving contaminated water reaching the distribution system, which never happened, and Mira personally overriding my shutdown order, which also never happened. She was 3 buildings away the entire morning and didn't get a call from me until the response was already fully underway. People like a story with a villain in it, and twin sisters, one runs the plant, one runs the AI that almost broke it, is a much better story with a villain than the actual, more boring truth, which is that we both missed something for 2 years because neither of us had built the specific tool that would have caught it, and then we built that tool together once we had a reason serious enough to justify the time. I correct people when I hear the wrong version, not because I need credit for catching it and not because I'm protecting Mira, but because the exaggerated version teaches the wrong lesson. It makes it sound like the fix was catching a bad actor. The actual lesson is considerably less satisfying and considerably more useful. 2 people who trusted each other's judgment completely still needed a hard, specific disagreement, followed by real work, before the actual gap closed. Nobody was the villain. The gap didn't care whether anybody was. We had the real conversation here, 3 days later, once the immediate contamination response was fully closed out and both of us had actually slept. This isn't a big room, as you can see, just enough space for a desk and a whiteboard nobody's fully erased since the last design review, but it's where most of the decisions that actually run this plant end up getting made, considerably more than the boardroom 2 buildings over ever manages. I keep coming back to the fact that I told you I couldn't optimize against a cost I didn't have a number for, she said, still standing rather than sitting, the way she does when she's working through something she hasn't fully settled yet. That's true. It's also not actually an excuse, is it? The vibration sensors were already installed. The data existed. I just never asked the model to look at it as anything other than noise. I don't think you were wrong to build FlowOptim around the cost data you actually had, Mira. I think the mistake was treating "we don't have a fatigue model yet" as a reason to keep running the plant on the assumption fatigue wasn't happening, instead of as a reason to go build the model before 2 more years went by. That's fair. I don't love hearing it, but it's fair. I'm not trying to make you love hearing it. I know you're not. That's usually how I know it's actually worth listening to. She pulled a chair around backward and sat down finally, arms folded across the back of it, the specific posture I'd recognized on her since we were maybe 11 years old, the one she takes whenever she's decided to stop defending a position and start actually working the problem instead. Walk me through what a fatigue model would even need. I want to understand the scope before I take anything back to my team. I spent the better part of an hour at that whiteboard, sketching out what a cumulative loading score might look like, pulling from vibration trend data we already had sitting and used in a database somewhere, cross-referencing it against the specific cycling pattern FlowOptim had been running for 2 years. She asked sharper, more specific questions than I expected, the particular rigor she brings to anything once she's decided it's actually her problem to solve rather than mine to complain about, and by the time we finished, most of what eventually became the fix was already sketched out on that whiteboard behind you, half of it in her handwriting, not mine. I want you to notice, because you'll be working under both of us eventually, that she didn't spend that conversation defending FlowOptim. She spent it asking me increasingly specific questions about cyclic loading until she had enough to take back to her own engineering team, which is, more or less, how every actual fix in this plant has ever gotten built, one of us being right about something specific, the other one taking it seriously enough to go build the fix instead of just agreeing verbally and moving on. FlowOptim runs differently now. It still cycles pressure to chase off-peak rates, that part never changed, because the cost savings were real and neither of us ever wanted to give those up. What changed is that every housing in this hall now carries a cumulative fatigue loading score, built from 18 months of vibration data Myra's team collected specifically to fill the gap that let housing 11 fail without warning, and any housing crossing a fatigue threshold gets pulled for inspection regardless of what the cost optimization side of the model would prefer. It cost us something, building that. Slower cycling on housings approaching their fatigue threshold means slightly less aggressive off-peak optimization, a real number on a spreadsheet somewhere that Mira has to defend to people above both of us every quarter. She's never once suggested rolling it back, not when a board member questioned the efficiency dip in her first quarterly review after the fix went live, not since. I've watched her field that exact question twice now, and both times she's given the same answer without any visible hesitation, that a slightly smaller efficiency gain running indefinitely beats a larger one that occasionally fails catastrophically, a sentence I'm fairly sure she's now said so many times it barely feels like a defense to her anymore, just a fact she's stopped needing to argue for. You'll notice, walking the rest of this hall with your training group over the next few weeks, that every housing carries a small secondary display now, right below the pressure readout, showing that cumulative fatigue score in plain numbers rather than burying it in some engineering-only submenu. That was my one real request once Myra's team had the underlying model built, that the number live where any operator on shift could see it at a glance, not because I doubted her team would monitor it properly from their end, but because I'd learned, the hard way, exactly how much difference it makes when the person standing physically next to the equipment can see the same thing the model sees, instead of trusting a dashboard 3 buildings away to flag a problem before it reaches the water. Mira and I grew up 2 towns over from here, in a house where our father ran the water treatment plant that used to sit where the new administrative building is now, long before either of us had any idea we'd end up running this facility together in our own way. I still remember him taking us both out to that plant on weekends sometimes, 2 8-year-olds trailing behind him through equipment considerably too dangerous for either of us to actually touch, both of us fascinated by different parts of it even then, Mira always drawn to the control panels and the numbers, me always more interested in walking the pipes themselves, putting my hand against the metal to feel what the water was actually doing underneath the readings. I don't think either of us noticed at the time how much that early split would end up shaping the exact disagreement we'd eventually have as adults, one of us trusting the number, one of us trusting the feel of the thing itself, both approaches genuinely necessary and neither one complete without the other. We used to argue about everything as kids, which route home from school was actually faster, whose turn it was to feed the dog, the kind of arguments twins have that outsiders always assume must be more serious than they actually are, precisely because we trusted each other enough to argue without either of us worrying it would cost us anything real. Our mother used to say the two of us fought like people who already knew they'd forgive each other before the argument even finished, and I think that stayed truer across our whole lives than either of us probably realized until this exact plant put it to a real test. I think that's the part people misunderstand most when they hear the short version of this story, the version where I caught something Myra's system missed, and it sounds, told quickly, like some kind of rivalry resolved. It was never a rivalry. It was two people who'd spent their whole lives comfortable enough with each other to say the uncomfortable thing directly, and a plant that happened to need exactly that kind of directness the one time it actually mattered. Here's the thing I actually want you to take from this walkthrough, more than the specific story about Housing 11. Mira and I have known each other longer than either of us has known anyone else alive, and we still managed to build a genuine blind spot into this plant together, not because either of us was careless, but because a system built to optimize one thing well will always be quietly indifferent to whatever it was never asked to measure. That's not a flaw you fix once. It's a question you have to keep asking, every time somebody builds something new in this plant. What is this thing not looking at, on purpose or otherwise, and who's going to notice before it matters instead of after? That question doesn't have a final answer, by the way, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I let you walk out of here thinking it does. We'll keep building new systems in this plant long after you and I have both moved on to something else, and every single one of them is going to arrive with its own version of the same blind spot, optimized carefully for whatever it was actually asked to measure, quietly indifferent to whatever nobody thought to ask about. Your job, more than any specific technical skill I'll teach you over the next few months, is going to be noticing which question that is before it costs anybody anything. You'll be the one walking someone else through this exact spot eventually. When you are, tell it the way I just told you. Not the break room version. This one.